Location-based entertainment for the masses has been around for a very long time. Ancient Rome is remembered for their gladiators fighting in the Colosseum. The Mayans played a ball game called pits in a large stadium, and medieval Europe regularly hosted carnivals and fairs centered around religious holidays. However, the earliest version of theme parks similar to how we know them offered a much more interesting experience. From spectacular theming to fantastic food to live music conducted by freaking Handel himself to going on walks in the dark with prostitutes? This week on We Love Attractions, we're taking a look at the history behind the infamous pleasure gardens. The 18th century was the age of commercialized leisure, and thanks to the growth of an urban middle class, rising incomes, and new ideas about how people should socialize and converse with one another, it was a period in which paid-for entertainment skyrocketed, especially in large cosmopolitan cities across Europe. One of the most significant innovations in 18th century leisure was the pleasure garden, a dedicated outdoor space for entertainment for which a ticket was needed to gain entry. The Wurstelprater Plaza in Vienna, Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, and Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in London were the largest and most spectacular of their type. So what were these mysterious pleasure gardens? Now largely forgotten, these were the theme parks of their time. Pleasure gardens were one of the chief sources of urban entertainment in both Europe and the United States during the 18th and 19th centuries. A theme park cannot exist without acres and acres of land. The word itself, theme park, contains a hint of what these attractions originally were. Large green spaces with urban environments set aside by royal charter for the enjoyment of the people. With features such as masquerades, organised walks, illuminations and live musical performances, the pleasure gardens were the place to be if you were looking to get your kicks and bask in debauchery. Access to these pleasure gardens were ticketed with the same kind of schemes that we see today at modern day theme parks. Single day tickets, special event tickets, annual passes and lifetime passes were available. The admission fee theoretically guaranteed that patrons would not have to rub shoulders with the lower classes of the city. A shilling was the going rate, and it was a substantial sum of money to an apprentice or servant earning just a few pounds a year. The owners of the pleasure gardens thought that if they charged an admission fee, it would keep away the riffraff, keep away the pickpockets, keep away the prostitutes. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. And the concept of ticketed admission was so offensive to some that full-scale riots and fights sometimes came about between those who paid and those who, shall we say, snuck between a hole in the fence. Restaurants were a common offering, and the Spring Gardens at Bath actually hosted a brunch on Monday and Thursday mornings, after which music and dancing were in order. One of the most common food items was very thinly carved meat. In fact, it was said to be cut so thinly that you could almost see through it. There's even a quote about Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens that said, "The Vauxhall carver could cover the whole gardens with the meat of a single ham." And as you can imagine, there was much to be offered in terms of theming at these early theme parks. Richly landscaped features, mazes, from bowling greens and lawns to extensive flower gardens and avenues of trees were the centerpiece of these developments. Striking architectural features entertained visitors at Ranelagh, from the Chinese pavilion to the Fountain of Mirrors, and guests commented favourably on the bucolic scenes interspersed with lambs at the rural downs in Vauxhall. They even displayed paintings by William Hogarth and Francis Hayman, effectively becoming the first public art gallery in Britain. At the end of the pathways throughout the pleasure gardens, there would be ruins of various places, and many of the guests thought that they were authentic, even though they were not. On gala nights, Gothic temples and other theming were set up to give the visitors the feeling that they were moving into different worlds. Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens was the place to go if you wanted to hear live popular music of the time. The famous composer Handel, who became kind of a composer in residence during the 1730s and 1740s, often played at one of the pavilions. Aimed at the wealthy, the aristocratic and the more prosperous sort of merchants, London's pleasure gardens were the very best places to see and be seen by the world. There were organised circular walks at both Vauxhall Gardens and Ranelagh. Strolls were curiously regimented in a circular direction to the tune of music. Ranelagh in particular was noteworthy for having the largest and grandest rotunda of them all, under which visitors strolled as if around an axis. When a bell rang, the promenaders all turned around and started walking in the other direction. The main walks were lit at night by thousands of lamps, and there were also different themes of walk for every occasion, including the Hermit's Walk, the Lover's Walk, and the Grand South Walk. These walks were a way to show off your favourite attire and even the latest date on your arm. However, there was one particular theme that caused a bit of a ruckus. The unlighted dark walks, or close walks, were known as the place for amorous adventures. It was said that along the pathways there would often be ladies of the night willing to, shall we say, walk with the gentleman in the unlit garden for a small fee. Vauxhall had a slightly dubious reputation. Its wooded groves and shady alleyways were the perfect place for a discreet encounter, and the well-dressed prostitute was associated with the garden to the extent that London print shops sold images with titles like the Vauxhall Demi-Rep, showing beguiling ladies in expensive but revealing clothing. As the years went on, the Pleasure Gardens' reputation for debauchery grew and grew. One of the most scandalous events at Vauxhall occurred at a fancy dress masquerade in 1749, when courtier Elizabeth Claudley arrived dressed as the classic figure Iphigenia, her costume consisting of nothing more than a thin scarf draped over her body, showing off more than it hid. Again, the press and print sellers had a field day. The price was raised in later years as more extravagant features were added. On select nights, visitors to the Pleasure Gardens could watch a fireworks display as the latest hit from Handel was played by a massive orchestra in the background. And the first ride was added too. Hot air balloon rides were common activities, and in 1836, the Royal Vauxhall balloon set an 8-decade world distance for the longest manned flight. Eventually, after about 150 years of operation, most of the pleasure gardens were closed. The lower classes, prostitutes and other deemed riffraff, were coming to the gardens to rub shoulders with the wealthy. They grew in size, thus making the upper class seek out other forms of entertainment. The popularity of indoor activities grew among them, and this is where we see the growth of dinner parties and other events held in the home. And so the pleasure gardens started to close down for good, lost to history. But we all know the story didn't end there. Very shortly after, a World's Fair was held which re-sparked interest in location-based themed entertainment. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, Illinois, gave us an early look at what a modern amusement park could look like. Soon after, the Midway would be introduced, which would become a standard part of most amusement parks, fairs, carnivals and circuses, containing not only the rides, but also other concessions and entertainment such as shooting galleries, penny arcades, games of chance and shows. And, in time, people started to return to themed gardens, although this time they had a lot more family-friendly attractions to offer. But not everything was exactly family-friendly. Find out what happens in the next iteration of the theme park, and also the origins of a popular phrase that we all know today. Click the link right here for the next video.